Okay, this is going to be a tutorial on how to do our court watch writing and also kind of other guidelines. So I have this 23-point list of things to go through, and then I'm going to go through our kind of a written guide as to how to write for journalism. So for those of you who have been in this program, this may be a refresher. Some of this stuff is going to be new. So we'll just go through it, and then as you have questions, just raise your hand and then we can go from there. All right, so the first thing is, what should you do in court? So the first thing, and this is kind of before you get to court, is you'll get your assignment. I'll say like Department 8. Now sometimes it'll be just simple, it'll be a trial, and so you really don't need to do this for a trial. But let's say you're coming in on a Monday, or you're covering what's called law in motion, which I'll get to in a few minutes. You're going to want to actually print out the calendar in advance, and so you can log on to the Yolo County Court website, and on the left side it'll say calendar, and then you'll hit calendar, and then you can select by case, and then you can print it out. So you want to do that. It'll give you the case number, it'll give you names of the defendants, correct spelling, and it'll also give you potentially the attorneys, assuming it's a private attorney. So the second thing you want to do when you're in court is you want to take notes on everything, because you really don't know what's important until it kind of hits you in the face, and then whenever I'm not taking notes in court, it always smacks me because I'm like, oh, okay, this is getting interesting. I should have been taking notes the whole time. So the best thing to do is take notes the entire time. And then you can always go downstairs to look up the charges, although you can now find the charges actually on the court website. And you can also go downstairs to the clerk and get motions, which I'll talk about in a minute here. So second, what should you write on? That's always the key question. Really, you're almost always going to write on trials. Most of the time you cover a preliminary hearing, you're going to be writing on that. And then finally, you're going to be writing on what I would call interesting motions. And again, I'll get to that in a minute. If you're unclear as to what you should do, you should just clarify with me or Marissa or whoever else is acting as the supervisor. So does everybody kind of understand what a preliminary hearing is? That's probably for you, Nicholas. I
guess I can kind of guess what it is, but...
So I'll just explain it real briefly. So a preliminary hearing is kind of like a mini trial. So basically, if the police arrest somebody, the police write down a number of charges. The DA's office then decides whether or not to file formal charges, and they formally charge the person at arraignment. At arraignment, the person will then enter their plea. But in order to actually hold somebody on charges, you need to have probable cause, and you need to be able to prove that you have probable cause, either through a grand jury or more often than not in California through what's called the preliminary hearing. And so they'll put on witnesses, they'll take evidence, the witnesses will get cross-examined. What differentiates it from a trial is that A, there's no jury, and B, usually the defense isn't going to put on their own evidence. So the prosecutor is basically putting on enough evidence so that there is some reason to support a charge. So really, you know, when you're watching a preliminary hearing, it tells you quite a bit about the case that we otherwise wouldn't know. And since a lot of cases actually get settled between the time they go to preliminary hearing and the time they get to trial, it's actually good for us to cover these, because in a lot of cases these might never be covered. So does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. So let's talk briefly about motions that you should cover. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but for the most part, anything that is a 995 motion, a pitches motion, and a motion to suppress evidence are things that we want to cover. So a 995 motion, we just talked about a preliminary hearing. A 995 motion is a motion to set aside a preliminary hearing, or basically motions to strike charges. So let's say, you know, you went through the preliminary hearing and you felt like the judge made an error in sustaining a charge, or maybe all of the charges, depending on the case. You could file what's called the 995 motion. It gets heard in front of a judge that isn't the judge that heard the original preliminary hearing, and the DA gets to file an opposition. They both submit arguments to the judge, and the judge makes the determination as to whether or not an error occurred. So it's kind of a fail-safe for a preliminary hearing. The reason why this is of interest to us is it may indicate a case where the charges are weak. It may indicate a case where errors occurred in the process. And again, it gives us more information about a case that may or may not ever go to trial. A pitches motion, which is something that we deal with a lot, is a motion to be able to see the personnel files of police officers. So you can find out if they have complaints, if they have reprimands and things like that. That's normally not something that is available to the defense unless they file for a motion and make a showing that that the police officer may have committed some sort of misconduct. So obviously, anytime there's an allegation of potential misconduct for a police officer, we're interested in that. Another interesting thing is that the DA isn't the one that actually defends that. It's actually the agency's attorney. So if you file a pitches motion in a case involving the Davis Police Department, the City of Davis's attorney actually defends it rather than the district attorney. And then finally, a motion to suppress evidence, 1538.5 is the number. Again, this is, you know, a possible indication that maybe some corruption happened or misconduct happened by the police, and so it's something that we want to look into further, and that gets filed. So, you know, in addition to being able to watch these arguments and the counter arguments by the DA, you can go downstairs and get copies of these motions and the opposition, which will provide you with additional facts about the case as well as arguments from both sides. It'll make a difficult article much easier, and will reimburse you for the costs. But anytime you're going to print off a motion, you should check with me to see if we want it. I may or may not want to do it. So check first. All right, any questions so far? All right, when should you write? So this is an important question. So for trials, they are technically due by midnight of the day that you watch the trial. So if you covered a trial today, you would need to turn it in by the end of the day today. realistically speaking, I'm normally asleep at midnight, and so I get up about 3:30. So as long as I have the article by the time I get up, you're okay. Now sometimes people have waited till like 5 or 6, and that starts getting a little dicey. So try to get it done by no later than 3 or 3:30. Covering for Friday is a little different. So we often don't want to run an article over the weekend, but sometimes we do. So generally speaking, you can turn it in by Sunday at 5 p.m. However, you should check with me first because, and interns often forget this, if we're covering a high-profile case, articles may come out from competing news services before we get your Sunday article. So you should check with me if you think you're covering a high-profile case, if you see other reporters in the room, to see if we want it immediately. The next point is, how long should an article be? So the first thing is that, we're not a newspaper, so we don't have stringent space limitations like a newspaper would. So the real answer to the question is it's as long as it needs to be in order to be thorough, and we definitely aim for closer scrutiny reporting than you would see in a newspaper. So my guideline is usually about 800 to 1200 words for a half-day proceeding. So if you cover the morning of a trial, think in terms of 800 to 1200 words. If you're covering a whole day, then you're thinking like twice that, 1600 to 2400 words. If you find yourself short on material, and that sometimes happens, you should check with me. If your article ends up less than 500 words, then we need to rethink it. So it's always better to check. So going along with that is point number 6, which is do not write a summary on everything you see. This is boring. Okay, so I will often, especially early in an intern's career, get a very long and very, very detailed article that is basically first witness A said blah blah and blah blah, and they asked him blah blah, and it just goes on and on. Again, this is boring. What you want to do is really tell a story. So if you're covering a trial, think of maybe 3 bullet points that you would tell your roommate if you guys were having a conversation over dinner or drinks, depending on how old you guys are. Pick the most important things. Don't do the whole laundry list, because, you're going to put the readers to sleep. Nobody is going to read through a 2,400 word article that's a laundry list. Instead, figure out, okay, what is the most important thing that happened? If I have to tell somebody one thing about what happened, what is that? What happened today? Or is it just boring today?
It was not too boring, but the center of everything, the witness that was at the center, she testified today, and she basically talked about one of the defendants that was not necessarily directly involved with the burglaries, but he basically went out bar hopping with them, came back, and he knocked out in the back seat, and because he was there, the defense counsel objected, and then there's a motion to strike, and I think that was there's tension. So
the most important thing was that there was a witness present who maybe shouldn't have been present, and therefore there was a big discussion over whether or not to declare a mistrial.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, that could be your first couple paragraphs. And then, was there any other detail that came out of her testimony that was important?
Well, I guess that was from the morning.
Oh, okay.
So they were talking about it before the jury had come in, but I got there early, so I was trying to catch on to it, but they moved on pretty quick.
Okay.
But from what I could get, yeah.
Okay. So that might be your lead.
Yeah.
I mean, really, think in terms of, hey, what are, and it doesn't have to be three. You always get taught, the 3 bullet points. Could be 4. I mean, it could be 2. Could be 1. Depending on what you see. But my point is, don't just summarize everything, because you're going to put people to sleep and they're going to hit the backspace and go on to the next article. All right, another important point, write from an impartial position. The Vanguard may or may not take a viewpoint on the trial. Usually we don't. But the basic day-to-day coverage really needs to be objectively reported without interjecting personal views, opinions, and analysis. There are several reasons for that. First of all, when you're watching a single day of trial, or even, Navi's covered this trial off and on over the last month or so, so she's probably as familiar with this trial as anyone, but, you don't know the full picture of what's happening. So you may see, little snippets of it, but you don't see the big picture. Second, it actually takes a lot of skill and art to competently offer an opinion piece. It's not as simple as, stating, well, I think she's a lying sack of something or other. It's, you need to, there's an art to it that I think is difficult for somebody who's just getting familiar with what's going on in the courts and getting familiar with writing. So the most important thing is that we have an objective perspective, and that means she stated this. Now, are there going to be judgment calls? Absolutely, because you're not going to be writing every single thing that happened. And so naturally, you're making a judgment call as to the most important material that you're going to present. And that's going to be true whether you write a 4,500 word piece or you write an 800 word piece. It's just that the 4,500 word piece has less judgment calls than the 800 word piece. So does that make sense? So we don't want your opinion, we want your observation as to what was said, the evidence that came forward. When we get to the writing tutorial, I'll get into this more, but you want to use short paragraphs. So you got to remember that people's eyes get tired and bored when you have a paragraph that looks like this. And so in academic writing, you sometimes have long paragraphs like that, but in journalistic writing, your paragraph should be a single sentence, possibly 2 sentences at most. You do not want to do long paragraphs because people get bored and they will stop reading if it becomes difficult. You also write, and again, I'm going to get into this more, you write a little differently when you write a journalistic article than when you're writing the 5-point essay like you're taught in English class. So you generally want to lead with kind of the summary of your article in a way. You want to express the main point in kind of general terms. You want to suck them in. You want to hit them hard with that first lead sentence. You don't want to say, in Department 8 there was a trial. He is accused of burglary. Okay, why don't you want to do that?
Too general?
It's too boring, right? If I'm reading the first sentence and, I'm like, okay, I don't think this is worth my time. I'm going to go on to something else. And so you need to hit them hard, and I'll get into this more in a few minutes. All right, 10th point. you are responsible for looking up your case information. So there is zero excuse not to get the full name of the defendant or the charges correct. They are on the court calendar. They're usually on the electronic display outside of the courtroom. If you do not know, ask the bailiff what the name of the defendant is. You should be able to look them up on the court calendar for that department. And once you look them up for the court calendar for that department, you should be able to find out what the charges are against them and be able to include all of that. The one thing that you may not figure out is the names of the attorneys. So you want to try to learn the names of the attorneys as you go on, because it's a small courthouse, and so you're going to see the same attorneys over and over again. Point 11 is fact check. Okay, make sure that you get the spelling correct. Your supervisor, your fellow interns, and Google are your friends. I can't tell you how many times I get an intern turning in a paper that doesn't have the first name of the defendant in a trial that we've been covering for a month. Okay? No excuse for that. Look it up on the Vanguard. Google the name. I guarantee you, you will find the information you need 9 times out of 10 on Google or the court calendar. Spend that extra 20 minutes reading your story aloud to yourself before you hit send. That 20 minutes will save Kathy, our copy editor, hours of work. Very important. When I see misspelled words, when I see grammatical errors, that tells me that you haven't gone back over your work. It doesn't take very long. An 800-word story isn't going to take very long to read out loud to make sure that you haven't made any grammatical errors. There are going to be errors. I have been doing this for over 10 years and I still make errors. So errors are unavoidable, that's why we have editors. However, minimizing those errors means that the editor can spend more time doing other things. So along the same line, follow what your colleagues are doing. If you're covering a trial, you should read the articles before you go to court. You should be, reading the Court Watch section of the Vanguard every day so that you see what we're doing. So that when you get into court, you understand the context of what's going on. Whereas, if you go in there blind, you're watching everything kind of out of context and you're not benefiting from the work that everybody else is doing. We do have a list of DAs, public defenders, and a somewhat dated list of law enforcement that we have available. We'll put all of this in a common place at some point, hopefully soon. All right, so this is very important. We practice slightly different rules for publishing names than standard journalism. And this is kind of developed over time because articles end up staying on the Vanguard for practical purposes forever. I've published articles from 2006 that are still up there. So, first rule, this is probably the most important rule we have. Never ever use the name of the victim unless I tell you to do so. And I haven't yet to do that, but it's been very rare when that's happened. Second, avoid using the names of witnesses except professionals. So anyone who is there who is basically their job to be there, they're getting paid to be there, doctors, police officers, investigators, analysts, experts, anyone whose job it is to testify in this trial, they're fair game. But, the guy's neighbor, the guy's wife, we don't need their name. You just use a descriptor, The neighbor of the defendant testified. The wife of the defendant testified. The witness testified. Sometimes instead of using the term victim, we'll use the term alleged victim. Or sometimes we'll call them the complaining witness. Why do we do that? Well, in some cases it's obvious that there is a victim, it's just not obvious who committed the crime. But in other cases, it may be a point in question that whether or not there is a victim. So, for instance, a sexual assault case. Often the question is, was there a sexual assault? So we don't know if the individual who is claiming to have been sexually assaulted is in fact a victim or not. So you can call them an alleged victim, or maybe a more polite term might be a complaining witness, the person making the complaint. Either way is okay. Sometimes people will use initials to describe the victim, so SK. It really depends. Now, obviously, if the victim's murdered, you can name them because they're already dead. They're not going to be stigmatized by the coverage. Most of the time, people have already, other media outlets have reported the name. The standard in journalism is not to name sexual assault or rape victims, but other victims they will name. That seems a little arbitrary to me, so that's why we've gone to the don't name victims. They don't need to be victimized even more by having their name on a website forever. So does that make sense? So let's say the mother of the victim testifies. Do you name her? All right, let's try this again. Use words.
Okay.
Do you name her?
No.
Okay. Police officer.
Yes.
Crime analyst.
Yes.
Psychiatrist.
Yes.
Victim.
No. Unless they're dead.
Unless they're dead. Good. Okay. I think that all makes sense. It's, this isn't rocket science, but, it's important to know. Point 15, this is kind of just a general rule. Don't speak to judges unless you're spoken to by them. Judges are, official part of the court. They're kind of set off. Sometimes a judge will I was sitting the day before Christmas a couple of years ago. I was in court and it was an empty court, and so I was sitting by myself in the back, and we were waiting for something to happen, and the judge starts having a conversation, and he's like 50 feet away from me, but he's talking to me through the mic, and I'm trying to answer him, and it was an interesting moment. That's fine. I mean, if the judge asks you a question, answer it. But don't try to walk up to the judge. First of all, the bailiff will break you down pretty quick if you try to cross the threshold. But just be respectful. You may attempt to talk to attorneys. The DAs generally won't talk to us, but just make sure that court's not in session, and don't interrupt their work. So if they're talking with their client, that's not really a good time to try to have a conversation or ask them a question. Just remember, we're observers in this process, not participants. 17, under no circumstances should you ever speak to a juror. If they ask you where the restroom is, you may point the direction, but don't talk to them. I do not want to be accused of jury tampering. It's just easier to, at most say you should ask the bailiff. but don't talk to them. You know, if they want to know who you are, especially don't answer that question. Anything that we could be accused of interfering in the court could be bad. Okay, does that make sense? For that, you know, this is real life. So, you know, for you guys, this is your internship. You're going to school. There's kind of a natural disconnect between schooling and the real world. Well, you're in the real world. So there are actually people that may have been hurt. There are family members of the victim potentially in the audience. There are family members of the accused in the audience. So you either have somebody who's been hurt or somebody who could go to prison potentially for a long time. Be respectful. You know, be courteous. I would suggest not to speak to them unless they approach you. If they want to talk with us, direct them to contact me, and I'll be happy to do that. That makes sense? Okay. Dress appropriately. So for men, that means slacks and a button-down shirt. A tie is not necessary. For women, that means professional attire, an appropriate dress, a button-down shirt or blouse, appropriate length skirt or slacks. What I don't want to see are people wearing t-shirts or jeans to court. Shorts are not permitted by the court itself, so if you wear shorts, they'll turn you away. And please, you know, dress modestly and tastefully. We want to project an image of professionalism. You're representing the Vanguard. And remember, while it's a big building, it's actually a small building. Everybody knows everybody. And the bailiffs and court staff will quickly figure out that you guys are interning for us. So keep that in mind. Along the same lines, don't use your phones in the courtroom. You can get kicked out. It can get confiscated, and bottom line, it's unprofessional. If you have to text, walk outside of the courtroom, go into the hallway. Remember, you cannot take photos at all in the courthouse. So if you get caught, you could get in trouble. Also, you know, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, get sufficient sleep. You know, if you fall asleep in court, not only will you miss vital information, but you could get kicked out, and it looks bad. And every so often, I'll have a bailiff walk up to me and tell me so-and-so intern fell asleep in court, sometimes for a long period of time. Sometimes they find it humorous, sometimes they are annoyed. So be mindful of that. Follow-up interviews are fine, but I would suggest you talk with me first. Finally, and this bears repeating, when you send your article, it needs to be spell checked and read through for grammar. We have a volunteer copy editor. She was actually in our first wave of interns back in 2010, and she volunteers her time every day and spends a lot of time fact-checking and going over your work. Making it easier for her makes it easier for me. So that extra 15 to 20 minutes that you spend can save her hours. All right, so that's that. Why don't we kill that for a minute? Okay, so this next part I'm going to be reading from kind of a how-to manual for journalistic writing. It's called Basic News Writing, and I will send this PDF to you guys tonight, hopefully. And it goes through the basics of how to write. And obviously, we're not expecting you to write like a New York Times journalist on your first week. But what happens is over time you become a much better writer, and it starts making a lot more sense. Now, the most basic question in news is, what is news? And in a way, you guys have it easy because you in a way know immediately that the news is what you are watching in the court. So you don't have to ask the question, well, is this news? Well, for our purposes, anything that's a trial or preliminary hearing is news. Now, are there going to be days when you're covering a trial you probably can't write an article? Yeah, there are definitely days like that. Sometimes you spend the entire time watching an analyst authenticating evidence, and it'll put you to sleep. I remember one time I was covering a case, and there was a video that the judge had to watch, and literally for the first 30 minutes of the video, you're watching somebody's rear end sitting on the hood of a car waiting for the police to do the search, and there was like one thing out of the whole thing that was worth seeing, but you just basically had to wait through the half an hour in order to see it. And the one thing, and then it's like, okay, what am I going to write? Well, this lady sat on the front of the hood of her car for half an hour, and then the officer went through her belongings. Okay, lovely. So, sometimes even in a court trial, it's not necessarily news. And as I pointed out to you, part of what you're going to have to learn how to do is basically figure out what's important to write and what's not important to write. So that's all important. All right. So we talked about objectivity and the fact that we want you to write from an objective and impartial perspective. The reporter's job is to find out the truth and tell it regardless of who might be uncomfortable. And trust me, the Vanguard is the master of making people uncomfortable with what we report. The reporter's responsibility, as implied by the First Amendment, is to serve only the reader. So I think this is an important point to keep in mind, that you're reporting what happens. Sometimes that may be damaging to individuals. Sometimes it may be damaging to the defendant. Sometimes it may be damaging to the defense. Sometimes it may be damaging to the prosecution. Sometimes it may be damaging to the judge. But your job is to report what happens, and you're really in there to be the eyes of the public, because remember, this isn't on TV. People don't know what's happening, and in most of the cases that you're covering, there are no other reporters in there, and the only way that somebody's going to know about what happens is if you write it. There may be a massive injustice that you see in this court, and it is your responsibility to be able to articulately and accurately and without bias report on it. So that is a big responsibility. And yes, you are an intern. But guess what? If you make a mistake in the court, I will often get phone calls. I'll never forget. I was on vacation. I was on a beach up in Cambria, and I get a phone call from somebody complaining that one of the interns had written an article and there were inaccuracies. That happens fairly frequently. So make sure that what you're writing is objective and accurate, and that is an art as much as anything else. The public needs unbiased information in order for democracy to survive. That means that your stories must be unbiased. Most reporters believe pure objectivity is impossible. When you select one word over another, your judgments enter the story. And I agree with that point. There is no objective truth. Everything is subjective. Because guess what? You're deciding that point A is important and not point B. You're making a judgment call. So, if you can't be completely unbiased and objective, you have to be fair. Fairness should be every reporter's goal. So what does it mean to be fair? Somebody offer me, what is fair to you? Davi?
You're picking on me today.
I'm sorry.
Fair, I would say balanced on both sides. So I guess in this case for the trial, the defense and the people. I don't know, in this situation, yeah, a balance.
Okay.
Okay.
What do you think, Jamie?
Like the most accurate, maybe, like depicting both sides in the same way, like in the same level of accuracy.
Okay. But what if the defense questions a witness for 6 hours and the prosecution cross-examines him for 15 minutes? So obviously, you're going to have a lot more to write about what the defense says than what the prosecution says. How do you balance that?
I mean, don't you just write more for the one that
Right.
asks more questions?
But I guess what's the measure of fairness? I mean, after all, okay. So let's take this a step back. I think fairness in court reporting is to accurately reflect what's been testified to. You don't have control if one side uses much more time. If you're accurately reporting it, it may be that you have 3 paragraphs for the defense and half a paragraph for the prosecution, and as long as that reflects what was said, then I think that's fair. What wouldn't be fair, maybe it's easier to describe what's not fair, right? So if the defense makes a case and then the prosecution thwarts it with a quick cross-examination, and you don't convey that to the reader that this guy just testified, and it looks like you don't say this, but you make it clear through citing what the defendant said and what the or what the witness said and what the prosecuting attorney asked. It looks like they lied. So you would say something like, the prosecution attempted to point out inconsistencies by asking blah blah, and the witness was not able to respond, or something to that effect. Fairness requires the reporter to recognize his or her own biases in the story. So maybe this happens, right? You watch a trial and you may sympathize with the defendant, or you may sympathize with the victim. So recognize that in your own mind. Okay, I'm kind of sympathizing with one side or the other. But let's make sure I cover this fairly, nevertheless. Take the devil's advocate approach. Ask yourself, okay, what if everything this guy's saying is wrong? Always look for the other side in any story. The neat thing about a court is that, you have examination and you have cross-examination. Now, the shortcoming is that if you're covering the morning, you may only see the direct examination and you may not see the cross-examination. But, you can only report on what you see. So keep that in mind. Use neutral language. Do not use exclamation points. Do not say "our college," for instance, when referring to UC Davis. The tone should be one of disinterested but an honest observer. A reporter's credibility is the only guarantee the reader has of the story's accuracy. There are no policemen in the newsroom forcing reporters to be accurate, although Kathy tries to do it. The First Amendment wouldn't allow that. If we write an inaccurate or biased story, readers will stop trusting us. All right, so does that all make sense? All right, so now we're going to go into the nuts and bolts of the writing process. So the lead is the first part. The lead is usually the toughest part of writing a story. The lead is the first word, sentence, or paragraph of the story. Sometimes it can be 2 or 3 paragraphs. Whatever its length, the lead has several important jobs to do. So the first thing is it must interest the reader in the rest of the story. So again, imagine the reader as impatient with lots of other things he or she could be doing instead of reading your story. Imagine me standing over you going, "Get to the point! Don't waste my time! I got a million things to do and I'm reading, this boring lead." If your reader were stranded on a desert island with nothing to read but your story, you could probably get away with a vague, rambling lead. But today's reader has a BART train to catch, the kids are fighting again, and the TV never stops blaring. Your story has tough competition. Hey, we run 4 or 5 stories a day in the Vanguard. You gotta somehow get people to read your story over the other stories. Surveys have shown that most people say they get their news from TV, but many turn to newspapers for details behind the headlines. Your job is to write a short, punchy, informative lead to attract readers who have grown accustomed to TV's soundbite journalism, but then you must supply the details, the insights, the context that TV doesn't have time for. What are the rules for a good lead? All right, so once again, and this is a repeated theme, keep it short, okay? News writing is always tight, but the lead calls for special care. Condense your story into 1 sentence, then 1 phrase, then 1 word. Okay, I'm going to pick on you again, Navi. Give me 1 word.
A random word.
No, to describe today.
Oh. Tense.
Tense. Good. No, that's good. All right. It was tense. Think about it. This trial has been going on for 6 weeks. A mistake may have occurred. It may have wiped out those 6 weeks. They may have to dismiss the jury and start all over again. That's tense. It's a good word.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious. That's really good. Okay? So think about that. Okay? Think about what 1 word you might say. Hey, you can't convey everything in 1 word. Right? I mean, it's not like, the word Eskimo. You guys are probably too young to get the reference. So, all right. Quick aside, sorry. So there was a movie, I think late 80s, early 90s, called Heathers. Anyone see it? Okay, well, the guy, they're in high school, and the guy is like this psychopathic serial killer dating this in-crowd, I think it was Winona Ryder, and they just murdered somebody, and instead of writing a note trying to frame him as suicide, the guy pulls out a book, underlines or highlights the word Eskimo, and basically says, "This will explain it all." And like the TV news picks up the fact that he had highlighted Eskimo and says, "Oh, this is a metaphor for how cold he saw the society," and whatnot. So anyway, Eskimo was like the one word suicide note that like said so much more than you could imagine. But you know, a single word can sum up the theme of a proceedings. So you want to condense your story again into one sentence, one phrase, one word. Make sure that word is near the beginning of the lead. And as a general rule, no lead sentence should be longer than 10 words. Now, of course, all rules are made to be broken, but I don't think, breaking the rules as somebody who's just learning the craft is the right way to go. Next, get to the point. What is the story about? Tell the reader in the lead. Don't say, "The city council met last night." Tell the reader what the city council did. Though business taxes were raised a whopping 30% on a 6-to-1 vote of the city council last night. What's the story about? Taxes. See, there's your one word. So get taxes in the lead. Let's say the prosecuting witness breaks down on the stand. That could be your lead. The word maybe breaks, or maybe contradicts, or maybe recants. Recants is a good word. Focus on the action. So use the active voice. Instead of saying something happened, say who did what to who. Use the action word. If nobody did anything, maybe it's not a news story. All right? Somebody always did something in your stories, because there wouldn't be a trial if nobody did anything. Right? Or if they did, then they get acquitted. But that's again an action. Hook the reader. Put the most important, most interesting, most exciting things in the lead. Okay, you know what it's called when you put the most important thing in the last paragraph? There's a term. 50 bonus points to the person who gets it. Ever heard the term bearing the lead? Yeah. If you put the most important thing at the end, you're bearing the lead. So you want to put it at the beginning. Your story goes from most important to least important. Now maybe you end it on some punchy note, but for the most part, the most important stuff is at the beginning, because that's what people are reading. People aren't going to read 10 paragraphs, or at least most are. These rules are sometimes thrown out for feature leads or anecdotal leads. So sometimes, you'll read a story that begins with kind of a story, Marissa was a hard worker when she encountered the Vanguard and it changed her life. Blah, 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 blah. Well, we're not really doing that, but sometimes in a trial you can pull it off. A really good writer can pull it off. I wouldn't recommend it unless you're really confident in your ability to write. I would recommend doing it kind of formulaic way of just, a strong, punchy first story. All right, so that's the lead. Any questions on the lead? Didn't think so. All right, the nut graph. Every story needs a nut graph which answers the question, why am I writing this, and why do I think the reader should read it? The best way to make sure your story has a point is to state it. Simply somewhere, damn it. somewhere near the top of the story. It doesn't have to say, the point of this story is, but if the story is about a budget shortfall, a good nut graph might quote a district official on whether the shortfall would force an increase in tuition. How does the story affect the reader? That's what should be in the nut graph. If it doesn't affect the reader, maybe it shouldn't be a news story. Quotes. All right, quotes bring a story to life. Let your sources tell the story. Quotes should be special. Don't use quotes for information that can be more clearly explained in your own words. So it's hard to quote unless you know shorthand in a court setting. You don't have a computer, you're writing on your hand. I can get maybe 7 words most of the time, often not. But putting those 7 words, especially if it's kind of an important thing that a witness says, is effective. So just make sure when you're using quotes that you're using exact language. But, and this is also important, another step is intended to achieve accuracy. The words inside the quotation marks must also convey the intent of the speaker. All right, anyone see the movie My Cousin Vinny? No one? All right, so My Cousin Vinny, they start out and it's 2 guys who are in college in the Deep South, and they get arrested for what they think is a shoplifting, and it turns out to be murder. And the sheriff's deputy is questioning one of them, and he goes, "Why did you shoot the clerk?" And the guy goes, "I shot the clerk?" ? And the guy goes, "Why did you shoot the clerk?" And he goes, "I shot the clerk?" ? Well, when it came time for the guy to testify, he omitted the question mark. So he got, "I shot the clerk," and he used it as though it were a confession as opposed to a question. All right, so that would be a case where you're accurately quoting the guy, but you're taking it out of context by turning it from a question to a statement, which, of course, leaving off the question mark completely changes the meaning of what he said. And so if you take a quote out of context, you could have it word for word and yet be completely wrong. So you need to be careful. To use the speaker's exact words to say something he or she did not mean is to take the quote out of context. It is a serious complaint often made by sources. At the end of the interview, okay, you're not interviewing people, and so you're not going to get to check the quotes, so you got to make sure you got it accurate. The proper form for using a direct quote is, quote, "I won't run for president, comma, quote, Dan Quayle said Thursday. Quote, but I may walk a little, period, quote. Notice the punctuation is inside the quote marks. The quote is attributed after the first sentence." Anyone know who Dan Quayle is? One? Who's Dan Quayle?
He was vice president, right?
Yep. Good job.
Misspelled the word
Potato. Yeah. All right. To minimize, also try to minimize the use of partial quotes. When asked about his presidential plans, Quayle said he, quote, "won't run." Well, you're probably, unless you're much better at writing than I am, only going to get partial quotes. So, yeah, take it under advisement. Indirect quotes don't have to use the speaker's exact words, but they must convey what the speaker meant. For example, Brett Favre, Thursday, denied reports that he would retire from football at the end of the season, but he said he is feeling his age. Indirect quotes can be used to introduce direct quotes. For instance, the next sentence in the Favre story could be, quote, "I feel every tackle of my career when I wake up in the morning, comma, quote, he said, period." Okay, makes sense. You guys have probably seen this a million times reading the newspaper. Yes? All right. Transitions. Each paragraph in your story should flow naturally from one before it. If you have gathered enough information and your lead is strong enough, you may find that your story seems to write itself, flowing naturally from beginning to end. But other stories seem choppy, with the narrative taking jags and loops that could lose or confuse the reader. Transitions smooth out those jags and make the story easier to read. Here are some guidelines. Make sure your story elements are presented in a logical order. Okay, so again, I told you don't just go, first witness 1 said blah, 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 blah. He was cross-examined, blah, blah. Then witness 2 testified to blah, blah. He was cross-examined, blah, blah. But it should have some kind of order that you're going to have to figure out how to order. Use introductions between speakers. So that's kind of easy. Now remember, often you're not going to use names, but they give the example, Ed Smith, professor of biology at Alone, disagrees with the idea that frozen yogurt causes split ends. That's the craziest idea I've ever heard, he said. Set the scene for a new area of discussion. Don't just start in a new direction without notifying the reader. For example, meanwhile, a group of Alone instructors have been developing another theory, one based on experiments with bananas. Quote, "We think we're on to something," end quote, said Professor Harold Foote. And then finally we get to endings. Although the news writer tries to put the most important information in the beginning in order to draw in the reader, it's also important to save something for a good ending. A good ending gives a rounded out feeling to a story, especially at the end, makes reference to information in the lead. For instance, in a story by a Monitor staff reporter about a young man trying to quit gang crime and turn his life around, the ending was, Valley gave a convincing yes when asked if he was going to graduate from college. This means he will have to see his mother cry again, although this time he will see her from a stage where he is wearing a cap and gown, holding a diploma in his hand. The lead had talked about how his mother cried when he received a scholarship to attend college shortly after release from jail. The ending made a smooth reference to the lead, tying the story together. Again, you probably will not be able to have neat endings because it's a court case and you're not seeing the whole thing, but at least keep in mind to save something for the end. All right, I think I'm going to call it a day with that. I will send this to you guys so that you can read it.